Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 753 Preserving Information Media lecture. This week is related to an introduction to digital preservation. I know that we've kind of circled around the idea of digital preservation during the first couple of weeks of class in our readings, but this marks sort of our official entry into digital preservation, and it's the first of a series of lectures that will focus solely on digital preservation. So let's go ahead and look at our weekly topics for this week. So what is the purpose of digital preservation? Why is digital preservation important? And what kind of resources are necessary for digital preservation to be successful? We'll kind of talk about these first two a little bit, but we'll mostly be focusing on this last one during the lecture. Okay, so we'll start by looking at some of the aspects of digital preservation that we'll cover during this lecture. And a lot of these things we'll focus on more specifically as we move through the semester. But this is just to kind of give you a little bit of a background for them and sort of build up your foundational knowledge of these different parts of digital preservation before we do a deeper dive on these topics throughout the semester. So we have access, authenticity, documentation, storage, sustainability, and collaboration. Okay, we'll start by looking at access. And access is ultimately the goal of preservation. It's sort of why digital preservation exists and why digital preservation is important, because without digital preservation, over time, records will either become inaccessible, perhaps because the hard drive that they're on has decayed, or it's difficult to access electronic records sort of using the medium that the content is captured on, like a floppy disk and so on. And the Owens chapter for this week talks about sort of the timeline for things like floppy disks and how, you know, after a couple of decades, it can be very difficult to get content off of this type of media. So kind of going along with what we just discussed before about how technology has progressed. In a lot of ways, records have become sort of more fragile and more at risk for no longer being accessible, especially in an authentic format. So that's why digital preservation exists, is to continue access to, at the very least, the informational content contained in records that are in archives. Okay, yeah, so related to that, the Herzinger article talks about how access can be achieved by changing storage media and or file format. So if you have a storage media, such as a floppy disk or a hard drive, that is at risk of becoming obsolete or inaccessible for some reason, then you may have to change that in order to provide access. If you have a file format that is at risk of becoming inaccessible because it's proprietary or because the software that you need to access it is difficult or very expensive to acquire and use, then you may have to change that before you can provide access to the content. And ultimately, access depends on knowing about the digital media on your stacks. If you aren't aware that there are floppy disks or hard drives or other storage media in your stacks and in the collections that you brought into your repository, maybe because you had more of an MPLP focus on processing and preservation, and you just, you know, didn't look closely enough to realize that there were digital records that need to be preserved, then obviously it's going to be difficult for you to provide access to them because, they may just sit in a box for however long before someone comes across them and says, oh, wow, we should do something about this. So sort of a baseline requirement is knowing what's in your collections. And again, as we've discussed already, MPLP can kind of make that more difficult. Okay, another important aspect of authenticity is, of access, is that the decisions that you make about access and what access to your digital records is going to look like should consider how to provide the most authentic experience possible, or the most authentic experience required or desired within your archive's abilities. So the resources that your archive has to offer, combined with the authenticity desires of your researchers, should strongly inform what kind of access you seek to provide. So if you are an archive that doesn't have a lot of resources, then it may be more difficult for you to provide access to records that are really authentic and really closely resemble the structure and content and environment of records when they were created and when they were being used. If your researchers don't really care about accessing records that are that authentic, then it might be a waste of money for you to really worry about providing that level of authentic access. So again, this harkens back to our discussions about permanence, and you just have to think about the resources that your archives can bring to bear and how that translates into the level of permanence that you can sort of maintain in your collections and your ability to provide access to records with a certain degree of authenticity and with a certain degree of permanence. So one thing that I should have mentioned before is all these aspects are pretty intertwined. So this would be an example of how access and authenticity are pretty closely tied together, as well as sustainability. And I'll try to encapsulate some of these interconnections as we move through the lecture. Okay, and so one interesting thing about access is it can be complicated by the number and types of copies. So if you are a repository that has it in its preservation plan that you're going to make, 2 copies of the original record and maybe 3 copies of access records, then you have to sort of juggle all that and make sure that you have access that connects to the record that you want your researchers to be looking at. So just kind of a little complication that archivists are faced with. And last but not least, access to electronic records or digital records oftentimes requires technical infrastructure that archives may need help with. So you need some kind of content management system that is going to allow your researchers to access electronic records, or you may need some kind of computer in your reading room that is going to allow researchers to have access to your electronic records. It's just going to vary from collection to collection and maybe even from record to record. But at the end of the day, there is going to be some kind of technical infrastructure that is required to serve as a bridge between your researchers and digital records. It's not like a book or a letter where you can just pick it up and read it. There's always some sort of technological barrier that you need to get through. And of course, acquiring this technical infrastructure, having access to this technical infrastructure, and knowing how to set it up so that your researchers can use it can be difficult, and it can require some collaboration, which we'll talk about later. And obviously, it involves sustainability, and that you need to have the resources to set up something like a content management system, or to be able to provide a desktop for your researchers to look at. So that's kind of a unique application for digital records that doesn't exist to as great an extent in analog records. You could say with like AV records, to some extent, there's still a technological barrier, but there are certainly analog records where that's not the case. Okay, so when you are sort of achieving the fundamental goals of preservation, which is to preserve the context and content of records, here are some questions that you might ask yourself. So how will the content be accessed? How will the context be accessed? You know, what's sort of the infrastructure that we need in place to allow that to happen, or to make that happen? Do we know what needs to be accessible? So do we know which aspects of a record need to be accessible? Do we need to provide access to the original, most authentic copy? Are we fine with providing access to a migrated version of a record? So how authentic does the access content need to be? And, you know, does authenticity really matter? Or are our researchers just fine with looking at something even if they know that it's been digitized, or the appearance and shape of the record may have changed over time? So again, some ties with authenticity. And we'll talk a little bit more, especially about these last couple of questions in just a second, when we talk about our next aspect of digital preservation, which is authenticity. Okay, so as we've talked about already, authenticity is based on the permanence of the significant properties of a record. So a record can have sort of several characteristics or several properties, but authenticity to a certain degree can be based on how well the significant properties of a record have remained unchanged over time. So the degree to which these significant properties are the same as they were when the record was created and used by whoever created and used the record. So to make things really complicated, significant properties may vary from researcher to researcher. So one researcher may find that some significant properties of a record are important and others aren't. And then another researcher, maybe from another discipline or with a different level or background of experience, might come along and say, well, you know, actually that really isn't too important. What I want to see in a record is this. So exactly what characteristics need to be preserved in order for a record to be considered authentic is something that the archival community has shed a lot of blood and ink deciding. I don't know that there's really still like a great answer to this question other than ask the researchers and find out what they need. But you know, there is a connection between the permanence of significant properties and authenticity, whatever those significant properties are. Okay, so one thing that is undeniably true is that the authenticity of records can be increased through a collaboration with the records creators. So working with records creators to get information about the content of records, about the context of records, about what the records were used for, how the records might have changed over time, and so on, can really give you a good perspective on how authentic the records that are coming into an archive are, and what type of information can be used to support a claim of authenticity that a record might make. So the relationship between archives and records creators or perhaps just the record donor, can be one that can really help archives make sure that records are as authentic as possible when they come to the archive, or failing that, at least know what changes to the record have occurred and what challenges to authenticity the record might have already been sort of impacted by or influenced by. So a good thing to keep in mind is that authenticity can change over time. And this could result from things like migration to a different file format. It can change to just the bits and bytes that make up a record decaying over time, just kind of naturally. So it's really important for archives to have an understanding of the degree to which records remain authentic over time. And ideally, this is done by having some kind of check of a record's authenticity when the records are brought into the repository. So archives can get sort of a picture of what the bits and bytes of a record look like, and then that can give archives something to compare with as time progresses and as the record at least potentially may change. Again, whether it's because of some preservation action or just kind of a natural decay. So it's a good idea for archives to be able to attest to and have some kind of documentation or evidence of a record's authenticity as it remains in storage on a server somewhere, just because then they can say either, yes, this record is exactly the same as it was when it came into the archive or even when it was created, or no, it's not the same, but it's because we performed these preservation actions on the record, and that's why what you're looking at might be different from what the record was like when it was created and used. So again, this brings up an interesting dilemma of, should archives be concerned about how authentic a record is compared to when it was created and used, or how authentic a record was when it was donated to the archive? So should archives intervene and at least attempt to make records coming into the archive as authentic as possible and as close to the shape of the record as it was when the record was created? Or should they really just be concerned with maintaining the authenticity of a record once it comes into the archive? So trying to preserve the authenticity of the record even before it comes into an archive, obviously it takes more effort and more collaboration with records creators than if you just say, okay, well, we're just going to kind of be content to document everything when it comes into the repository, and that's really all that we have the time and attention to do. So in the Herzinger article, they made some steps to try and work with records donors and increase the chances that they were going to receive records that were more authentic. But that's not necessarily something that every archive can do. So again, you just kind of have to think about the resources that your archive has to bring to bear on authenticity, and really just do the best that you can. Okay, so one great thing about meeting authenticity needs is it can increase sustainability. So if you are able to maintain a level of authenticity that meets the needs of your researchers, that may make it more likely that researchers are going to continue to use your archive, and that they may use your archive to create products like articles or documentaries or published works that you can point to and say, look, this is why our archive is important, because people are making these uses of our archival materials, and we would like you to support us because our archive is being used. So while authenticity can certainly be costly to maintain, there are some benefits of trying to keep archives as authentic as possible. So authenticity can certainly be challenged by obsolescence. Again, if records come in file formats that are obsolete and you basically have to migrate them in order to provide access to them, then that can impact the authenticity of the record. Sometimes if a record is in a file format, unless you're willing to sort of move heaven and earth, you just have to say, okay, well, we're going to take this format and change it to a TIFF or a PDF or something that's kind of more mainstream and more easier to preserve and provide access to. And, that can have obvious implications on the authenticity of the record itself. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, authenticity can be challenged by a lack of sustainability. If you just don't have the resources to keep a lot of the significant properties of your record stable, from the time that the record comes into your archive or from the time that the record is created, then that may well result in records that are less authentic. And again, sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes it can be important. You just have to sort of understand what your researchers want, what your researchers expect, what your resource allocators want and expect, and try and meet their expectations as best you can. Okay, so again, some questions relate to authenticity that an archive might ask when preserving the content and context of records. What do we need to preserve? What sort of essential aspects of a record are important for us to maintain over time? And how do we know that? How do we know that these are the expectations of people that are going to be using our records? Do we have some kind of evidence to back that up? Are we just kind of spitting in the wind and guessing? Or what's our rationale for thinking we know what we need to preserve? So just generally speaking, how can we support authenticity? What steps can we take to make sure that our records maintain a certain level of authenticity over time? And what are some of the pros and cons of doing so? Again, maintaining a high degree of authenticity can be more expensive, but it may also lead to greater research satisfaction, and that can benefit your repository in the long run. And these are all questions that you should ask when you are working on your preservation plan, which is something that we'll touch on later. But a big part of the plan is collaborating with researchers and with experts to say, okay, what are sort of the acceptable losses in authenticity within this type of record or within this collection, and how can we avoid losing this information that is so important? So just kind of highlight the connection between a couple of the aspects of digital preservation that we'll be talking about, namely authenticity, collaboration, and documentation. So there's 3 right there, okay? Like I said, they're all tied together. Okay, so the next one that we'll talk about is storage, which is a really important part of digital preservation because, ideally, or at least theoretically, you're going to be preserving these records into the indefinite future. So you really have to think about what the storage conditions that records are going to be held in during all that time, what those conditions are going to look like. So ideally, these conditions are described in the documentation related to digital preservation that your archive creates. and regularly reviews and actually follows as you're storing your records and as time progresses. So there should be something in your preservation plan, for instance, that says, this is the type of storage we're going to have. We're going to have copies in different geographic locations. We're going to have copies on different types of servers and physical media, and just a description of what these storage conditions are going to be. And storage can be a challenge to sustainability. If you think about a collection that may have, terabytes and terabytes of information, especially if it's from like a photographer or someone that may create a ton of electronic records, that's storage that you have to pay for. While storage is pretty economical compared to what it used to cost, it can add up pretty quickly. So it can be difficult to have the resources to meet the storage needs that a modern archival collection might require. I make digital art, and some of my digital art, is maybe a few gigs. So say if I had, a few hundred of those, or if you throw in the files that I use to make my digital art, that's some extra storage that's required. It can add up pretty quickly. And, I'm not like the most prolific artist ever. So just kind of an example. So yeah, storage can cost a lot of money. And you have to make sure that your storage is stable and secure. So again, making sure that your records aren't going to be damaged or aren't going to be decaying as time progresses. So, maybe even having something that says, we want our servers to be stored in these conditions, because that will sort of reduce the likelihood that that the server is going to fail, or that records on the server might decay because of the conditions that the server is in. So you can really kind of get down in the weeds and have really specific conditions for your storage that again are going to result in storage that is stable and secure and will at least slow the process of decay present in every type of record. Okay, so relate to that, your storage should not be in formats or on hardware at risk of obsolescence. The last thing you want to do is say, okay, we're going to store all of our stuff on hard drives. And, maybe in 20 years, those hard drives are no longer accessible. Heaven forbid there was an archive like 30 years ago that was like, we're going to store all of our stuff on floppy disks because, I'm sure you can access floppy disks somehow, but it may be pretty difficult, and you just don't want to rely on a type of storage that may not be very accessible in the future to store your archival materials, which again, theoretically are going to last for the foreseeable future. Okay, and as the Herzinger article notes, storage can be very basic. You want to have things that sort of meet the basic criteria of digital preservation storage. But, it can just be as simple as a couple of servers somewhere. You don't have to necessarily pull your hair out and try and get the most sophisticated and complex storage ever. As long as you meet some basic goals, then that's usually going to be good enough. One sort of basic goal of storage, though, is it should be distributed. So you should have your records stored on servers that are kind of scattered all over and not just in one kind of central location, because if there's a fire or something, or those servers are destroyed, then you don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket and lose all of your records. So distributed storage is kind of a baseline requirement or desire for archival storage. But generally, if you meet that, then you don't necessarily have to worry too much more. And we'll talk about storage towards the end of the semester. Okay, so as with excess storage can be complicated by the number and types of copies. So if you think of, a digital photographer who might have, terabytes and terabytes of photographs, and then so you're going to keep those, and then you're probably going to keep 2 or 3 preservation copies of each photograph. So that can add up really quickly. And then, you have to pay for all that storage, and it can really start to snowball. So it's just something you have to keep in mind. You're not only providing storage for one copy of a record, but likely multiple copies as well. So that's why, as I mentioned before, storage can be a big challenge to sustainability because all this stuff can really add up. Okay, so some questions that you might ask when you are when you're storing your records. Again, how will we store our records? Sort of what are the conditions that we want to store our records under? And then thinking about which factors might complicate this discussion. Probably, what do we have the money to do? What kind of storage do we have the resources to realistically, put into place? And then, you just have to kind of meet somewhere in the middle. We would like to store our records in this way and under these conditions, but we only have the resources to store our records under these conditions. So, we're going to have to compromise and kind of meet somewhere in the middle. Okay, so next we'll talk about documentation. So this would include things like a preservation policy and a preservation plan. And so we'll talk in a little more detail about those in just a second. And the Becker article for this week really focused on a preservation plan and sort of the different things that a preservation plan should cover to a pretty granular detail. So that would certainly be a type of documentation that archives are really encouraged to have. So generally speaking, these types of documentation, and especially a preservation plan, are going to detail the storage conditions and other strategies that archives will follow, or guidelines that an archive will follow when preserving digital records. So, here are preferred file formats. Here's the level of authenticity that we're going to aim for. Here are the storage conditions that our records will be held under. Here's what we're going to do with privacy. Here is the form that we'll have donors fill out when they donate electronic materials to our records, which is something that the Herzinger article touched on. Just all the documentation surrounding your digital preservation policies and guidelines, and how you want your digital preservation to be carried out. So this can really aid transparency, which is something that we've talked about in this course already. It can really kind of lift up the hood and show researchers and the public and resource allocators, this is why we're making the decisions that we're making. And that can allow them to understand digital preservation a little bit better. It can help them understand the challenges of digital preservation a little bit better. It can help them just understand why you made the choices that you did. And even if your choices aren't, 100% right or perfect, if you did had to compromise because of a lack of resources or whatever, you can sort of justify your decisions and at least have your side of the argument out there, which can be pretty beneficial for your archive and for your archive's reputation. And this documentation can be a great sustainability tool and a great advocacy tool. Especially resource allocators, and I would imagine researchers and possible donors want to know that there's some kind of method to the madness, and that you're not just kind of spitballing and handling every digital preservation challenge differently, but there is some kind of structure or some kind of consistency in how you approach digital preservation, and that ideally what you're doing is has some connection to things like professional best practices, standards, which are things that you can mention in your policy and in your plan, that you can demonstrate that what you've done is based on consultation with researchers or digital preservation experts, and that you really have put some thought into how you carry out digital preservation, because that's going to make people feel more comfortable about using your records for research. It's going to make them feel more comfortable about supporting your digital preservation efforts. It's going to make them feel more comfortable about donating materials to your repository. And all these things are going to benefit your repository in the short term and in the future as well. So to talk a little bit more about a digital preservation policy and a digital preservation plan, a policy is more sort of the broad canvas. So the whole picture, kind of a bird's eye view of what digital preservation is. So, here's our mandate, here's our mission, here are some best practices that we want to follow, here are some standards that we've consulted. Just kind of a bird's eye view of what digital preservation is. And this is mostly going to be an outward facing document, or one that you might show to a resource allocator and say, here's why digital preservation is important. Here's what we see as our role within digital preservation. Here are the standards that we've looked at, and so on and so forth. A digital preservation plan is going to be something that is much more focused, where you can actually see sort of the individual brushworks of digital preservation and kind of the granular details of, here's the level of authenticity that we want to see. Here are the file formats that we're going to prefer. Here's how we're going to handle different file formats that come into the repository. And this might be more inward facing and might be a policy that only the archivists at your repository really want to or need to look at. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value, because you want to have structure, you want to have stability and consistency in your digital preservation plans, and it's important to have the details too, instead of just having the big picture. And the Becker article for this week does a really good job of describing some of the different considerations that might be made when developing a digital preservation plan, and what that process might look at. So again, really focused on collaboration with researchers to determine levels of authenticity, determine how to most efficiently provide that level of authenticity, and looking at triggers for when a digital preservation plan might be revised. Just really having some granular detail about what digital preservation at an archive might look at. Now, take a guess which, at least from my sleuthing, is more common to see than the other. I definitely see a lot more digital preservation policies than I do plans. I guess it could be that these just aren't as publicly available, but it seems really easy to find the preservation policies of archives. But if you try and get more detail and see how these policies are actually going to be enacted, that seems to be more of a difficulty. I don't know, again, if they just don't exist or if they're less accessible for whatever reason, but it seems like these are more commonly accessible than the actual plans are. So I don't know, read into that what you will, I guess. So some questions about documentation that you might ask when preserving the content and context of your records. So which decisions are made about digital preservation? So what have we decided to do when it comes to the digital preservation activities at our repository? Are these decisions documented? Is there something that we can go to consult to make sure that we're handling digital preservation in a stable, repeatable, or repeated way? And are the documents that guide our digital preservation updated regularly? So, is it something that we're looking at every couple of years, or is it something that hasn't been looked at in, maybe a decade, or, well, yeah, hopefully not longer than a decade. And more generally speaking, how will you communicate digital preservation to others? What documents are you putting out there that are going to communicate to researchers and resource allocators and potential donors what kind of digital preservation you're doing, what are the challenges, and so on and so forth. So the Sandy article mentioned including a communications plan and documentation as well. So that might be something or a type of documentation that would help you communicate digital preservation to others. So some kind of plan for different types of outreach that you're going to do in order to help convince people to support your digital preservation efforts. Okay, so next we'll talk about sustainability, which is a huge part of digital preservation. So sustainability should determine your digital preservation plan. Again, you can really only do what you have the resources to do. And if you develop a digital preservation plan that is sort of way beyond the resources that you could possibly devote to digital preservation, or that you should rationally devote to digital preservation, then you're going to find yourself in trouble, because you're going to be striving to do something that you just don't have the resources or the expertise to actually do. And so what's the purpose of developing something that you can't actually do? All that's going to accomplish is you're going to waste the time and effort that it took to develop a policy, which you definitely don't want to do if you are an archive that doesn't have a lot of resources, right? So you really need to think about sustainability when you're developing the different guidelines and standards that you want your digital preservation to follow. Sustainability requires outreach and collaboration. You need to convince people why they should support digital preservation, why digital preservation is important, and that involves outreach. It involves emails. It involves meeting with resource allocators. It involves meeting with potential donors. It involves meeting with researchers to make sure that they like what they're seeing at your repository, especially researchers that are maybe more likely to produce something that your archives can promote. So, you just can't kind of sit back and expect the money to flow in. You really need to be active about getting out there and drumming up support for digital preservation, which, as the Sandy article notes, can be very, very resource intensive and can require a lot of resources. And as we'll talk about in just a minute, collaboration can be very important for archives, and it can make the difference between an archive's and a digital preservation plan that is sustainable, or one that that maybe just kind of founders in the water. Okay, yeah, so sustainability can be aided by collaboration, which I'll talk about here in just a minute. Sustainability can involve the use of open source tools. So we're looking at a few of those in this course. There are plenty out there. And we'll talk more about other digital preservation tools later on that are open source. Open source doesn't necessarily mean completely free. You know, some can take a fair amount of expertise to set up and maintain. So ones like Bit Curator can take a fair amount of work just to get going. Uh, and you know, there are some like Droid, which are really easy and really straightforward, and you know, pretty much anyone can get up and running. So there's sort of the house cat open source tools, which are like Bit Curator, which you know you may get the cat for free, but you know maybe your cat will only eat prescription cat food because that's sort of what they're used to eating, and maybe that prescription cat food is expensive, so you have to kind of pay to maintain it, right? You have to take it to the vets, and so on and so forth. And then there are open source tools like Droid, which are more like barn cats. Like you just kind of put them in the barn and they kill mice and eat mice. You know, maybe you take them to the vet, but generally there's kind of out of sight, out of mind, and you know they're not very resource intensive at all. So you know some open source tools are maybe more sustainable than others, but it's certainly better than paying a lot of money for some proprietary tool that might be difficult to maintain and cost money just to have access to. So, okay, so when you're thinking about sustainability, it's very important to consider the amount of records created and archived. You know, as I mentioned before, there can be a ton of electronic records out there, and uh, you should really think about that when you are when you're thinking about sustainability. So if a collection has terabytes and terabytes of information, is that one that that we really should be thinking about bringing into our repository? You know, a collection has records in a format that is really difficult to preserve. Is that a collection that we should be bringing into our repository? An interesting thing that the Herzinger article mentioned was that sustainability of digital preservation may result in the digital preservation responsibility being distributed among several staff. So there may not be just one person who does digital preservation, and may be a responsibility for a handful of staff members in your repository. You know, it'd be great if you could just hire one person and they can devote all their time to digital preservation, but having that level of specificity in archives might be beyond the staffing level that archives are oftentimes able to have because of a lack of resources and you know, an overall lack of sustainability. So Herzinger mentioned digital preservation as taking small steps with what you have. And I think that that is a really good description of what sustainability looks like when it should come to digital preservation. You know, you don't need to shoot for the moon right away. If you only have the resources to do X, then just do X. And don't worry if it's not perfect. Don't worry if your storage is very basic, as long as you are doing a generally good job of preserving records and maintaining the authenticity of the content and context over time, then that's probably good enough. Okay, and again, something that I touched on a little bit earlier, sustainability should really be considered when you're appraising digital records. If you are looking at a collection that has terabytes and terabytes of electronic records, or if you are appraising a collection that has records that are in formats that are going to be very difficult for you to preserve, then again, you just have to kind of think, okay, can we realistically preserve these records, or you know, should we pass and you know, hope that someone else is able to take care of them in the future? You don't want to take on more than you can, right? Going back to this idea of taking small steps with what you have and not trying to ingest entire large complicated collections at one time, or perhaps even at all. So, you know, you just have to do the best that you can. Okay, so some sustainability questions that your archives might ask. Uh, which resources do we have for DP? What resources? I can never remember if I'm supposed to use which or what, but that's okay. How can we best use the resources that we do have to meet to meet needs, whether it's the needs of our researchers or so on, the needs of the archive as a whole. What are the implications of a lack of resources? And that might be we have to pass on a collection, or we have to distribute digital preservation responsibilities among a few different staff members instead of having just a specialist who only handles digital preservation. And also thinking about how can we gain the resources that we need. So going back to this idea of outreach and advocacy and collaboration, and using those three things to convince people, either convince people to support your archives or to find ways that don't require a lot of resources to improve your digital preservation efforts. That may be related to something like using open source tools. We have this problem, we need this resource to take care of this part of digital preservation. So how do we get this particular resource? We find an open source tool like Droid, like FITS or the data accessioner or even Bit Curator, and we use that to solve the digital preservation issue that we're attempting to address. It could be we sit down and have a meeting with the dean or the head of libraries. It could be that we work with another department on campus. There are a lot of ways to answer that question, and it's an important question for archives to ask, as hopefully you're well aware of by now. Okay, and then last but not least is collaboration, which has a lot of ties to a lot of the things that we've been talking about already, and I'll attempt to kind of fill in that blank here in just a minute. Okay, so collaboration can involve working with resource allocators, working with skilled staff. So if there are people on your campus that have maybe IT skills that you don't possess, then it can be a good idea to collaborate with them and to hopefully use their time and knowledge to support your digital preservation efforts. You certainly can get a lot of value from collaborating with resource allocators because that may make them more likely to support your digital preservation efforts. So maybe you collaborate with them when you're developing your digital preservation policy or your digital preservation plan. That says to them, we care about what you think, we care about your input into our digital preservation efforts, and it sort of gives them some investment or some connection with what it is you're trying to do. It can be flattering, and people like to be flattered. People like to hear that you value their opinion, and inviting them to collaborate with your archive when you develop or revisit your digital preservation plans and policies can be a great way to sort of deepen a relationship with someone that you need to support your repository. Another great type of collaboration is working with other archivists or other consortia. Pretty much every archive to one degree or another is struggling with digital preservation. So it's always good to reach out to other archives and to other archivists and say, okay, how are you handling this aspect of digital preservation? What open source tool are you using to ingest records? What do you think of trying to maintain this file format? There's a whole ecosystem of information about digital preservation out there that archives are generating and that archives are working with every day. And if you don't tap that and attempt to incorporate it into your digital preservation efforts, then you're really depriving yourself of a resource that can be very valuable for your repository. Consortia can also be a great type of collaboration. So in the Herzinger article, the authors mentioned working with a meta archive for distributed storage. So this can be a great way to get knowledge about digital preservation. It can be a great way to store your records in a way that is more economical for you. So there can be certainly benefits with working with other archives in more of an official sort of consortium relationship. So that's something that archives should consider as well. I touched on the importance or the value of working with records creators or donors to attempt to get as much information about a record as possible so that you know what's important to preserve, so that you get an understanding of how records were created, how they were used, so that you can help, so that you can encourage them to use certain file formats when they are creating and using records. And that's something that the Herzinger article touches on as well. And they talk about how when you're working with donors and creators, you need to make your interactions and your collaborations with them as simple as possible, because otherwise they may not do what you ask them to do. They may just kind of ignore you. And that's not the ideal way that an interaction with a records creator or a donor should do. So you always have to be respectful of their time and of their maybe background and level of interest, and just make it as simple as possible for them to help you, because it can benefit your archives in the long run. Again, something that we'll talk about later on in this course. Okay, I touched on working with researchers to find out what preservation needs they have, and maybe learning about how you can help them. Again, that's something that the Becker article touches on when developing a digital preservation plan, so overlap with documentation. Working with researchers are really working with all of these different parties can be a great way to develop a digital preservation plan or your digital preservation goals. So if you work with skilled staff, that may help you realize that you have access to resources that you didn't know, and may help you realize some limitations that you didn't know existed. If you work with other archivists, they may have digital preservation plans that they've developed, and they may be willing to share those with you. So all this collaboration can really help you codify what your digital preservation is, and how you're going to carry out your digital preservation activities. So again, that's just so much better than trying to recreate the wheel and use your perhaps limited knowledge and resources to create something that maybe someone already has, or something that you can copy. So I think it was the Herzinger article that just said, we're not going to worry about file formats. We're just going to say, we're going to do what the Library of Congress says is what we should be doing. And that's that. That's all we have to worry about. We're just going to follow the Library of Congress. We don't have to write out this whole policy when something already exists. So, why recreate the wheel and waste resources doing so? Okay, and again, this collaboration can be a great way to advocate for digital preservation. If you get people involved with what you're trying to do, if you educate them about what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, whether it be resource allocators, other skilled staff. So the Herzinger article talked about working with the Office of Libraries Technology. The more you sort of involve these people and get them involved with your efforts, the more they're going to have invested in your digital preservation, and the more they're going to want to see it succeed, because now they have skin in the game, and now they have a connection with your digital preservation efforts. And an interesting thing that the Sandy article notes is that a need for collaboration may increase with the complexity of records and a desire for greater authenticity. So the more ambitious or developed your digital preservation policies and goals are, and the more you try and incorporate complex records like databases, I think was one example that the authors used, or the more you try and provide access to records through things like emulation that provide a more authentic experience, the more you're going to need to collaborate to find out how other people have done this, to have the technical skills and expertise that you need to provide access to maybe more esoteric file formats. And it's going to really increase the amount of resources that you need to bring to bear on digital preservation, and thus the amount of help that you're going to need from other people. So something important to consider as you develop your digital preservation policy is thinking about, well, who can we collaborate to help us solve this problem, or who can we collaborate with to help us meet this standard or this goal. Okay, so some questions you might ask: who else is doing digital preservation? Who has skills that we don't? Can we work with these people? Can we develop some kind of a relationship with them and have them help us with the problems or the issues that we're having with preserving digital records? And kind of relate to that, how can collaboration make us more sustainable? Is it possible to collaborate and get storage this cheaper? Is it possible to collaborate and have access to people with IT skills that we wouldn't otherwise, that we don't have within our archive, which is certainly much better than trying to hire a whole new staff member? How can we use relationships with other people to make things more affordable, more efficient, and to make digital preservation overall easier? Because easier means less time, it means less money, and that means that you can accomplish more with your digital preservation than you would be able to do if, again, you're trying to do everything yourself, and it's just difficult and it's a slog, and you're spending far more time than you need to develop your digital preservation infrastructure, policies, and so on. So yeah, just as an overview, kind of generally speaking, you have your access, authenticity, and storage, and then an undercurrent of sustainability, collaboration, and documentation. So when you're thinking about the level of authenticity you want to provide, you should think about, is it sustainable? How can we collaborate with people to achieve the level of authenticity that we want? Or how can we collaborate with people to even determine the level of authenticity that we're going to shoot for? How can we document our decisions about what authenticity looks like in our digital records? You can really attach all these three things to, again, this sort of undercurrent of sustainability, collaboration, and documentation. And that's really what this Sandy article touches on. Is it's not just one thing, it's not just a one-legged stool, it's a three-legged stool, or maybe even more. And you really do need to think beyond just the technology, or just the content, or just the management and documentation, but you really need to think about all of them and how they all tie together. And we'll revisit these relationships off and on as we move through, focusing more specifically on individual aspects of digital preservation for the next, I think, 10 or so weeks of this course. So again, this is just kind of an introduction to these different issues, and we'll elaborate on them more in the future. Okay, so that's it. Yeah, I hope that you learn more about digital preservation and some of the issues related to digital preservation, some of the things that archivists have to consider when addressing these issues, like access and storage and authenticity, and again, more to come. So if you're feeling a little in the woods right now, don't worry, we'll be revisiting things through the rest of the semester. So yeah, thank you for listening. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and take care of yourselves.